Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. When we sit at our computer with an image like this within Lightroom, something we've chosen to edit, I'm often reminded of how similar image editing and in-car satellite navigation is. Now I know what you're thinking, what on earth is he on about? Just bear with me for a moment. If we know where we want to go and we tap that information into our in-car sat-nav, it generally works brilliantly. But how useful is sat-nav if you're not sure where you want to go? Pretty useless, right? Isn't it very much the same with editing? If we know where we're going with an image, we can always find the tools to take us there. But if we're not quite sure what we need to do to take an image from the original capture to a completed picture, then our image editor is also pretty useless. What makes a good picture is a skill that we have to learn, because we need that skill to take us up to the time when we actually press the shutter button, but also when we're sitting in front of our computer, as we are here in Lightroom. So let's go through this image and I'll talk you through what I'm choosing to do and why. But here's one more thought before we start. I'm not quite as fluent with Lightroom as I am with Adobe Camera Raw, but that's part of my point. I don't have to be. Because, and here's the sat-nav analogy again, unless I know what needs to be done, the how it's done is almost irrelevant. Does that make sense? Let's get to the fun stuff. I'd like to start by looking at the colour balance. It's almost right, but perhaps not quite. If I click to bring this image up to 200%, I can detect a magenta cast, particularly in the tree trunks in the distance. Now that's going to have an effect all over, not a great effect, but it's worth dealing with. And to do that, I'm going to go to my eyedropper tool here, the white balance selector. Now I did this before I started recording, and I needed to click a number of times. I'm looking for a neutral tone, something which we should expect to be neutral in colour. It took me a few clicks before I actually got a setting which I liked. So to speed this video up and to save a bit of time, I'm going to go over to the settings on the right hand side because I settled on 5900 in the temperature, and in the tint I settled on -2. Now I found those settings simply by just clicking around on these areas until I got something which I felt was right. Let's go back to fit this into the screen. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, but I'm going to hit Ctrl Z to undo that. Now look up into those hills as I bring that change back. It's subtle, but it's worth having. Good place to start. So moving over to the basic tab on the right hand side, I'm just going to look at the exposure a little bit. Just bring it up a little bit, not a great deal. That looks okay. Looking at the image, I don't really want to change too much. Maybe I could investigate the highlights because we are going to have to do something with that sky. Maybe I'll bring the whites a little to the right and the blacks a little bit to the left. And what that does is increase the contrast because we're putting a separation between the two. I'm looking at the histogram at the top of the screen sometimes, and I'm quite liking what I see at the moment, but maybe I could do with a little more light on the image, particularly on that tree. Let's start around that particular point. If you want a bit of clarity, that's okay sometimes, that can help. And maybe even a little more vibrance. Depends how much colour you like to put in your images. Now if you look very carefully, you can actually see, I've still got the eyedropper tool here, you can actually see there's a couple of lines coming across the scene here. To be honest, I used to get very annoyed at that sort of thing, and I would spend hours removing them, but they're a fact of life, and I've tended to just ignore them these days. I don't think it impacts much on the appeal of the image. So let's select one of the masks, and on this occasion we'll allow Lightroom to select the sky. We've got to be a bit careful here. I think the manipulations in the sky have got to be delicate. Let me remove that overlay for a moment, tuck the panel away. Because if I drop the exposure down too much, you can see it just doesn't look right. So we've got to be careful here. We've got to take it as far as we dare perhaps, but not too far. So a little bit of exposure down. We're dealing with highlights, so let's step them down. They help a little bit too. To add a little bit of contrast in the sky, I can spread the whites and blacks. So if I move the whites one way and the blacks the other way, keeping an eye on the histogram up there, but I've actually put a little bit of contrast into that. I don't want to go too far, something like that. But looking at the colour of the sky, maybe I would decide to put a bit more warmth into the sky. This is a personal thing. We're all going to choose something different. But we've still got a couple of areas of the sky which I'd like to adjust. I think the balance between the sky and the hillside is about right, but it's quite light there and quite light along the top. So why don't we add a graduated filter along the top and a little bit of masking using a brush, maybe over on the left hand side or wherever else we feel we need it. Let me open up the panel. Let's use the little plus here to add a linear gradient. I can click and drag right at the top because I just want to come down, but I don't want to encroach too much on the top of those trees, because one of the things we often see in landscapes like this is when the sky's been darkened, telltale signs all along the edge there. So we want to avoid that. Let's remove the overlay. Let's tuck that panel away a little bit. So what do we want to do here? Let's drop the highlights. A little change there. Let's drop the exposure at the top. You can take that down nicely. I think this area over on the left is just looking quite natural. Maybe I'd like to darken this bit on the right, but I don't want to darken this bit. So why don't we add another? Let's add another, but this time a brush. Now what do I want to do with this brush? I want to darken the highlights on the top right. I don't think the highlights is going to do a great deal there. It's probably moving more towards mid-tones, to be honest. Let's just drop the exposure down. And what I'll do here is make my brush a little bigger. Now you can look at the settings for the brush here. The flow rate is very low, so I am going to get this very delicate. Whoops, I moved it a little bit then. Control Z will undo that. Let's just brush over that again. You can see the sort of effect I'm having. Not a great deal, so maybe I can tweak a little more into this. Subtle stuff, and I'll do a little bit right along that top edge too. And I think that looks okay. So now I think the foreground needs a bit of work. Once again, back to my masks here and a linear gradient. I'm going to click and drag up the screen. We can see exactly what we're going to impact. We're going to encroach a little bit on the area at the base of this tree. Whether that's going to have a negative effect, I'm not entirely sure yet. Let's take a look by going over to the sliders on the left hand side, and I'm going to drop down the exposure quite a bit here. Something like that. That's looking okay, not looking too bad. Now, if we just study the image for a moment, what I said in the introduction, if you look at the left, you can see the left-hand side does have a bit of weakness, because now we've dealt with the sky and the foreground. Now our eye tends to move towards the left-hand side. So once again, we can have as many of these gradients as we like, and as you can see, as we mouse over them, they're identified. We can name them all, But to be honest, it's such an easy task to just mouse over to identify what we've done. And of course we can go backwards and forward with these masks and the changes we've inflicted within them as many times as we like. Let's go back to the plus though and select linear gradient again. Over to the left hand side, click and drag inwards. Bring the exposure down there. Maybe I'll just bring that back a bit so it doesn't impact the tree too much. But now when we look at the picture, maybe the right hand side needs the same treatment. Okay, let's do that. Linear gradient, click and drag. And we'll drop the exposure down. Now the picture's beginning to have a little more life, I think. Let me just tuck that away. In fact, I'll click on the masks to remove them, and I think sometimes it's a good thing to have a timeout. We sit back or we walk away from the computer and we come back in a few minutes' time. Not always possible, I know, but if you can do it, it often works wonders. Now I have just done that, and I come back and think I've done a little bit too much to the right hand side, and this is what's the good thing about masks and working with raw files. If I go back to my masks and identify the mask I'm looking for, as soon as I select it, I can go over to here and I can back off a little bit the changes that I originally made. Now what I'd like to do next is to maybe put a bit of colour in strategic locations, but I've also got a darkness under the tree. Do I want to keep that there to draw the eye, or do I want to lighten that? I think we're all going to have a personal view on that, but as this is a demonstration, let's lighten that first. So back up to the masks. You can see that these masks are going to change the way we create our images. Brush, I'm going to zoom in. That's a little bit too much. Let's go back to 100%. Just having a little look around here. Okay, so I am going to just mask around here. I'll tell you what we may do first. I may just take the shadows up and the exposure up a little bit. I'll keep that flow rate fairly low, but a little bit higher than we had it. And we'll just try it here, just to lift the tones around here. That's doing a bit, but not a great deal. Let's squeeze a bit more in. A little bit of darkness down there. Let's try it down there. See, it's working. We need to work delicately with these brushes, otherwise they tend to run away with us. And when they do that, we lose control and the picture starts to look a little bit unnatural. But here we can just take it very carefully, knowing at any time we can go back and change those sliders. And I'm just building up the tones to get just the relief of the shadows that I feel I want. Let's go back to fit in screen, and there you can see the difference. So let's look at this little bank of growth here. I was going to say reeds, but I don't think there was any water there. So once again, I'm going to pick up yet another mask. Let's go back to our brush. I'll drop the size of the brush down. We've got the mask ticked here, so let's do the masking first here. This is a sort of thing I thought we may want to change. And there's a little bit of blue flowers along the edge here. And we could do this much better if we zoomed in. Rows of growth along the edge there. And the reason I'm doing these ones is because if I increase the colour a little bit there, it's going to help, I think, guide our eyes from the right side in towards the tree and the left side in towards the tree. Well, that's the theory anyway. So I'm going to go over to the saturation and push it up to its maximum. It doesn't do a great job, but if I double click and reset, we can see it's making a difference. But not a great one. Let's try bringing up the exposure a little bit. You can see what I'm doing here. I don't want to come too far and make it look obvious, but I can come up a little way because I'm trying to steer the eyes in from the right hand side towards the tree and from the left hand side towards the tree. I'd like to get a bit more colour in this area. I wonder if I can do that. Let's have a look at the colour panel down here. And we'll take a look at the yellows here. You see how it starts to make a change there? That's the sort of thing I was hoping to achieve. So let me have a try with that. But what I want to do is to go back and do just a little more masking. Let me drop the brush down. And I'll go a little bit along the edge there. Now you can see I'm getting a little bit more of what I was trying to achieve here. Now, if I was working in Adobe Camera Raw, some of this work, to be honest, I would leave and I would deal with inside of Photoshop. Because another area, and while I've got those settings, I may actually use this same brush to try to bring a little bit more interest around this area here. Just a bit more colour. Just something to lead us into the picture. Now I'm doing this quick and dirty, as you can see, but you get the idea. So I've had a couple of minutes time out just to give a little more thought to the image. Looking at it now, I think I wouldn't mind introducing just a little more shading on the left hand side, but I've got a mask already created so I can tweak that very easily. But what I often do is I look at the tree that is the focal point, and I may want to try to just lift the tones and add a little more colour to the highlight areas of the green. Now it's very small stuff, but I think it often makes a difference. So if I were to tackle that, let's go to the 100%, I think, and click. These are the areas I'm talking about here. So maybe if I go back to my brushes, my masks I should say, and I create a brush and I push up the saturation, and maybe I'll just tweak down towards green a little bit, that may help. Maybe a tiny bit of exposure just to help as well. And this time I will push the flow up a little bit higher. And with a brush, I will just brush over these areas. I'll adjust the flow until I get what I want, and also the settings here. That's a little bit too much. But maybe now I would just walk around this area and I would just give the tops of the trees a little tweak. You can see this isn't time consuming work. It's just one of those small steps which sometimes can make a big difference to the images we're creating. And if you need to, of course, you can get the image even bigger. Now I spent 5 or 10 minutes, I think, just carefully doing the edges of that tree just to make it stand out a little better from the background, a little more colour, a little more brightness. I've adjusted the gradient on the left just a little bit darker, and just a few touches to the trees over on the right hand side, exactly the same thing as I did with the main tree centre left. So what I often do to finish an image is to put one final mask in place. So I'm going to go to my mask because I'm going to select a radial mask. Now once it's in place, if I click and drag, you can see the actual size and shape of it. We can make these any size we like. I want to have it coming out quite a long way here, right to the edge. It doesn't matter, sometimes I actually do break out the edge. This is the softness, and we can see that up here, and sometimes I may even want to make that a bit more. The other thing we've got to do though is to invert this gradient, because at the moment we want the outer edge, well, we've got the center selected, we want the outer edge. So what I'm going to do here now is just bring down the exposure a little bit, just on the edge, that little vignette. And I think that's all we need. Let's tuck that away to get a better view. That's all we need to tighten up those corners. Maybe I've gone a bit too far. We can back off a little bit. Sometimes if these sliders get a little too delicate, then go to the values and over type them. It can sometimes be a little easier. Then I think I would be prepared to say we've got a completed image. So with many of our image editing subjects, we need to know what needs to be done to improve the interest and appeal. Without that, we can't begin to ask the next question, how do we do that? Sometimes quite a significant difference can be made by raising the tones in a row of trees, some grasses, or just adjusting the tone of the tracks in a landscape. Often it's strategically adding colour, or in fact removing it. While it's going to be different in every single image we create, the tools and techniques remain remarkably similar, but of course with our own added particular likes and dislikes. It's why photography is an art. I'll see you next time.